Welcome back to Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small. My co-host is Paul Ogden. We're here with our guests, Joe Hentzler, the American Constitution Party, John Strinka, the Socialist Party-USA, Jay Parks of the Green Party. We're coming to you from Big Hat Books in Broad Ripple on the north side of Indianapolis. It is February 12, 2012. Big Hat Books is one of the participants in World Book Night. You can go to worldbook.org to find out the details on that. You can get 20 books and of one title and give them away to friends that they'll read, and it's really kind of cool. This is located at 6510 Cornell Avenue in Broad Ripple on the north side of Indianapolis. They have space here for special occasions. They have an art gallery. G.C. Lucas Gallery is showing paintings here. It's really kind of spiffy here. If you get a chance, get here. It's locally owned, so it's not a big box store.
And they're having a wedding reception today, later.
No, it's a birthday.
A birthday?
Yeah.
Birthday
and
celebration.
so there's all sorts of neat stuff. Now, John, you were just finishing up something before we went to break, and then we started having a really neat conversation off camera. So finish up what you were saying.
Okay, I'll finish my point, and then we can get to the off-camera stuff. That'd be great. What I was saying is basically the representation is a good idea, but it's premature. Currently, as it stands, there are two issues obstructing or hindering the efficacy of third parties. The first is the structure. I mean, for instance, we've already had discussion here. Major party candidates need 4,500 signatures for a statewide office. Minor parties, such as the Greens or myself or your party, 34,000. So gross disparity just in the requirements there. Okay. Point out in states such as Ohio, which has recently lowered their requirements to 500 signatures for state office, we had a socialist candidate run for the Senate, and he got press coverage, and he ran a viable campaign. So I mean, so you can correct things by structurally changing the laws. However, the more important part is really attitudinal. Okay, for whatever you want to say about the American electoral process, okay, people do not always behave rationally. All right, what happens is that people get very much caught up in the horse race aspect of it. Talking before, but everybody wants to vote for the winner. I would agree with Joe that the point is a vote that is not for your principles is in effect a wasted vote. I mean, the lesser of two evils is still evil. All right. What we need to do is basically get into the minds of people that there are different political solutions than the one we're presented by both major parties. If I may, I'd like to present kind of two sea changes in American culture. One is the civil rights movement, and two is smoking, okay? If you go back 50 years ago, the vast majority of the population held very different views than they are today. By a combination of legal measures and popular action, raising people's consciousness, making people aware, a sea change in attitude was effective. And that's the kind of thing we have to do in conjunction with a change of the laws to make third parties viable in the United States government.
Now, when we went off the air,
yes,
yeah, you turned to Jay and you said, well, the Socialist Party has a lot in common with the Greens and everything, and then you addressed it to Joe and said, look, we agree a lot about the problems in the society, and pick up there.
Right, I'll pick up on it, and what I said, and then I'll open it up to you, Joe, is that even though I'm very much on the left and you're very much on the right, I think what we share in common is a populism, and that we're both very frustrated that the government no longer responds to the people. Now, our solutions to that are very different, but on that diagnosis, on that problem, we most certainly agree.
Yeah. And I think on a lot of issues, I mean, Greens and Socialists and Constitutionalists would look at issues, for example, intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. We would all, three of us, oppose those interventions.
Absolutely.
But we would probably have three different reasons. But in a congressional setting, where you and I and Jay representatives, we would have 3 votes against the military intervention, So third parties make strange bedfellows. You end up working together in unlikely combinations for common purpose.
But isn't that the way the two-party system functioned 60 and 70 years ago? Because I remember reading, when I was a kid, the Republican Party had 5 or 6 different factions that included liberals, and the Democratic Party had several factions that included extremely conservative elements, in fact, reactionary elements from the Dixiecrats.
Well, if I may, what's
Yes.
happened is that, particularly with the increase of our technology, it's been much easier for the major parties and their corporate benefactors to control the process. All right. What happens? For instance, a century ago, you had the populist movement, you had the Grange movement, and so forth, and those people were very successful. I mean, what happened? They succeeded in ultimately getting the progressive amendments of the 1910s passed. The direct election of senators, the income tax, things like that. Okay. And the reason for that is that the major parties were still to some degree responsive to their constituents. In other words, when the third party had a good idea, all right, one of the 2 major parties would co-opt it,
Yes.
okay, and they would take it over. Now that didn't help the third party. As a matter of fact, it kept the third parties down, but it did help represent the people, and it did create social progress. Now, third parties are no longer given serious public consideration, and so that effect no longer happens.
And that goes back to the idea that Paul was saying a while ago, what effect of third parties had in the late 1890s. They had a significant impact. If you look at the impact today, third parties, for example, in Florida, the Greens. I'm not going to lay this guilt trip on you, but, well, yeah, I am. In 2000, Ralph Nader quite possibly swung the election because of the votes in Florida. And I mean, that between that and the Chads, and the Supreme Court ignoring the Constitution, this all had a part to play. But that's the third parties have had a significant effect, and I think also in 1968, when you're saying, when I was referring to the old times and what change happened, I think when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and then Richard Nixon was looking as an opportunist and realized he could carve off what had been the Solid South. I think the third party that George Wallace had created had an effect, and it had the effect of shifting a big chunk of votes over to the Republican Party that traditionally had been Democratic. Because the Solid South all of a sudden now is solid for the Republicans. But in looking at, for example, you were talking about constitutional change. What is it that would need to be changed in the Constitution to allow some kind of, I mean, the individual House elections are not a matter that is necessarily controlled by, they're means by which the individual states control their own elections.
I can speak a little bit. Their municipalities have actually looked for election reform, and it doesn't need constitutional change. Minneapolis and San Francisco have both adopted a ranked choice voting, where instead of voting for one candidate, you rank your candidates on the ballot. So you could rank 1, 2, 3. In order to win in that kind of system, you have to win 50% or more of the vote. And if no candidate does that in the first round, the candidate with the fewest votes, his votes or her votes are redistributed to the other candidates, and then it's tallied again, and that keeps happening until either there's 2 candidates and one has a greater number, or one has won 50% of the vote.
Yeah, I believe the Libertarians favor that. It's a complex concept. I'm not sure if you can explain that to people. You explained it very well.
It is, and it's worked with some success. San Francisco's been doing it for almost 10 years now, and Minneapolis has used it, I think, in the last 4 years. It went through some constitutional challenges through the courts and been upheld as well. And it's worth noting that these places that have adopted it, Minneapolis has Green city councilors. San Francisco has had supervisors from the Green Party, so it does allow other parties to make a breakthrough. The mayor's race in Oakland with Gene Kwan, who's been the subject of a lot of the Occupy protests, was actually a race that was affected by instant runoff voting. So it's playing just with simple changes to municipal elections.
And that goes back to another point and I don't mean to segue this to different points. And if there's something you want to go back to, by all means we can. But one thing that I've been struck by is that when I go to the election polls, for one thing, I really don't like having people try to hand me stuff at the last minute. Second, and that's in the chute, like that, within 50 feet of the door of the polling place, they're not supposed to be doing anything. Second, I'm going to do this. When I go in there to vote at the primary this time, I'm going to be standing there at the little table. I'm going to pull out a coin. I'm going to toss it in the air, go like this, and then mark just to see if anybody notices. That I'll already know whom I'm going to vote for. But the third thing is, whenever I go into the polling place, it's Democrat, Republican working the polling place. There's nobody from any other party. And I think that a local approach, they say all politics is local. And I'm asking, I guess, generally, I know that the Greens obviously have done local work in terms of local government. Is that one aspect that alternative parties should be pursuing? And if so, I mean, what are the steps that you do on that? And do you agree with me? I mean, if you don't agree with me, tell me I'm wrong.
A lot of it depends on the local election officials. Election inspectors in Indiana don't have any partisan nominations. So in Marion County, they've allowed Libertarians and Greens to serve as inspectors because it's not required that you be from one of the major parties.
I didn't know that.
The inspectors are supposed to follow the Secretary of State's rate. They're supposed to be, I think they're supposed to be, well, which is Democrat, Secretary of State, whoever wins.
You just admitted that the Secretary of State here is a Democrat. Ah.
No. Who wins the Secretary of State's race in that particular county, Marion County.
Ah, okay.
But the fact is, it's so hard to get people now. They are taking anybody. Republicans, Green Party people, Libertarians as inspectors.
And that's a sad commentary. We worked the polls for 3 different, 2 primaries and 1 general, and we were hustling at the last minute to try to get people to work the polls.
They'll take just about anybody.
Yeah, so
it took you.
Well, let me point out, I mean, part of the problem with this, again, is the path our society has taken. I mean, for one thing, because people feel disconnected, they don't readily become involved in the political process. I mean, one of the things that we've in general lost sight of is the fact that democracy is hard work. If you want to be represented, you have to do the work, you have to talk with your neighbors, you have to organize. In a society where pretty much every last waking moment is devoted to figuring out how you're going to pay your bills, that just isn't forthcoming. The other thing, within the 2 parties, and this, there is in effect, a reward structure, a hierarchy. If you're a precinct chair for the Democrats or for the Republicans or whatever, all right, it's not like it's, any kind of payoff or anything like this, but there's a certain amount of payoff and prestige and advancing, a political cause, all right? Because it is so difficult for people, to put aside they're just earning a living, they don't participate in politics, and it's very difficult for us to just gather the manpower to man the polls and to get signatures and the rest of it. So really, I mean, one of the things we would need to do, for instance, would be a public financing of elections, so that people who did want to participate would be free to, things like that.
And so reducing barriers would get more participation.
Absolutely.
We're at the end of the 3rd segment. We'll be right back.